Well, thank you very much. My name's Timothy Lee. I'm the Senior Vice President of Legal and Public Affairs for the Center for Individual Freedom, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak with regard to intellectual property and brand protection and patents, especially as it relates to the COVID crisis and the innovations that have been necessary to address that crisis. So, thank you for this opportunity. This is a very passionate subject for me personally and for our organization. Believe very strongly in property rights. And what I'd like to speak about very briefly to you all is the value of property rights. It's not just something that I appreciate, but it's something that enhances fairness. And it's also something that enhances utility, which is obviously the primary concern of your organization. And so thank you again for having me and allowing me to speak on this topic. So first, I'd like to talk about fairness and why intellectual property is important in that regard. Just like it's fair for physical property to be held by the person who owns it, whether it's a car or a house or land that you have paid for, it's unfair for somebody else to just take that or use it for their own purposes. The same is true of intellectual property. If I invest billions of dollars on something to create a patent, or if I create a song, which is copyright, or if I come up with a trademark, which is also intellectual property, those are things in which I've invested. And if somebody else can just take them or appropriate them, that's not fair. And so I think most people can understand that point. Now, what's also important to note, though, is that, and along with your organization's ideals, intellectual property and patents specifically maximize utility and efficiency in human life. And so, to give you just a couple of quick examples, the United States has some of the strongest patent and other intellectual property rights in the world. And as a result, we create almost 2/3 of new drugs introduced to the world each year, year after year. Our scientific innovations are due in large part, if not primary part, to patent protections and other intellectual property protections. They protect artists and innovators who invest the time necessary to come up with those innovations. The drug industry is a perfect example. Last year, we celebrated 40 years of what's known as the Bayh-Dole Act, which is named after two US senators. And The Economist magazine said that it is perhaps the most important piece of legislation passed in the United States over the past half century. The reason for that is what it did was expand patent rights for universities and nonprofit organizations and other groups that didn't exist before. And as a result, we went from about 400 patents for universities and similar organizations in 1980 when the act was passed to hundreds of thousands in the 40 years since then. And that has been particularly true of pharmaceuticals and drugs. And so it's important to note that it's not coincidence that nations like the United States or like Finland or other European nations that protect intellectual property more and patent rights more see more innovation, whereas nations rated very low in terms of protecting intellectual property like Venezuela or North Korea or similar nations like that don't see that sort of innovation. And so what you recognize quickly is that strong direct correlation between patent rights and innovation. Now, over the last year, we've seen that firsthand. I think most people understand across the world that creating a vaccine for a virus takes time. Typically, it takes about a decade, sometimes 15 years, and billions and billions and billions of dollars. But we were able to do this in 1 year, really less than 1 year. We're saving millions of lives across the world by these vaccines that were created in nations that protect patent rights. And so you can see that direct consequence. And I think people across the world can begin to understand, even if they never thought about this issue before, how important patent rights are to creation. And I think people seeing the vaccines coming out and saving lives and the decline in deaths that we're already recognizing can see firsthand why those strong patent rights ultimately led to the vaccine being created in less than 1 year for one of the world's deadliest pandemics. That is a perfect illustration of why patent rights are important and an illustration of how they lead to innovations of that sort. Now, what we begin to enter, though, is once those vaccines and drugs and other pharmaceutical innovations are created, sometimes groups that don't value intellectual property rights suddenly think that they're entitled to those, and they want to undermine patent rights in order to access those drugs. The problem with that is a lot of places across the country that don't, or excuse me, across the world that don't necessarily respect production requirements and safety requirements can't just be given the ingredients to those drugs and allowed to distribute themselves because they don't follow those. And so across the world, you're already seeing fake vaccines that attempted to be based on some of the vaccines created over the past year to end the COVID crisis. And they're either useless or ineffective, or they're actually harmful. And so we've got to be very, very careful about that. And so when people talk about brand protection, that's important for some of these groups and companies. And by the way, a lot of them have collaborated. It's very important to keep protecting that because those groups that we know are following safety standards in the manufacturing of these ideas that they came up with due to strong patent protections need to be allowed to carry forward on that. Now, you then get to the point of a lot of impoverished nations that don't have some of these strong patent protections and therefore haven't seen some of these innovations and therefore do not have a lot of these life-saving drugs available to them. The positive news there is the United States and other nations that do have these vaccines and have produced these cures and vaccines for the coronavirus and COVID pandemic are sharing them. Once we create them safely, that allows us to not only vaccinate our own populations, but to send them overseas. And just this week was yet another announcement by the United States government that it's going to be sharing those things. And so when people across the world begin to think that the answer to getting more vaccines and other life-saving drugs, whether that's during a pandemic or just dealing with ongoing life-saving issues, is to undermine patent rights, the exact opposite is true. All that will do is mean that some of these drugs and vaccines and other innovations don't get invented in the first place. Because why would I, as an inventor, invest all of that time and billions of dollars in creating something that can just be taken as soon as it's created? The better answer is what we're witnessing already, to strongly protect patent rights and other intellectual property, which leads to creation and innovation, just as we've seen with the vaccines for COVID, which then can be shared with other nations and impoverished peoples in order to vaccinate them as well. We are already seeing this before our very eyes. The alternative is to not protect patent rights or intellectual property, in which case these things won't be created in the first place. And so that's why it's important to strongly protect intellectual property rights. It serves the interests of fairness, because if I create something or if somebody innovates in some way, it's fair to reward their innovation and their hard work. But it also maximizes utility, as we're seeing before our very eyes. And across the decades, you can look back and see that nations that protect patents and other intellectual property see much more inventiveness and innovation. And now it's literally saving tens of millions of lives as we speak. And so the best way to move forward is to keep that system strong, protect it. With regard to Bayh-Dole, the act that was in 1980 here, we can't undermine it by allowing, whether domestically or abroad, people to disregard it and just march in and take drugs because they think that they're entitled to them or the price is too high. The better way to go about it is to keep doing what has worked in the past And let's keep moving forward on that. We've got a lot more lives to save. And in the future, who knows what other innovations will come. But when they do come, they will come primarily because of strong patent and brand protection and other intellectual property protections. And so thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And we're seeing before our very eyes the miracle of human innovation, due in large part, if not primary part, to strong patent rights and other intellectual property rights and brand protections. So thank you very much.